get familiar with the way
Sorry.
you talk.
I don't know.
I got it solved.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Student Achievement and District Instructional Performance Committee of the Whole meeting for September 6th, 2023. We welcome everyone in the audience and ask that you silence your cell phones. Ms. Wagner, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Bolton? Present. Mr. Craig?
Here.
Ms. Jones? Here. Dr. Moffitt? Mr. Morosky?
Here.
Mrs. Weinberg?
Here.
President Lindy?
Here. Thanks, everyone, for being with us this afternoon. We have three exciting topics on our agenda this evening. Depending on how quickly we move through those, I thought if we have time before 5:30 and not after 5:30, but if we have time before 5:30 after we've gotten through those three, I would love to have at least a first conversation with the group about those 3-month priorities, given that it is now the month of September. And we will turn things over now to Superintendent. I think we'll go straight to our lobbyists. So anything you want to share first? Great, then we're excited to hear an update from our lobbyists. Thank you.
I did it right this time. Okay, to the chair, to the superintendent, and to the treasurer, my name is Eric Kearney, and I'm joined with George Glover. As you know, Mr. Glover is the main party on the relationship. So we provided a report to the superintendent, and it contains 3 parts. One part goes through the budget discussion, which is obviously the most important part of the state government's work. It also provided a list of bills that either the superintendent or members of the board have asked us to review. And then the third part is just general news and information, or the third part is other bills that have been introduced. And then the fourth part, excuse me, is general information that we thought that the board might like to know, and it's wide-ranging in terms of state issues. I'd like to talk about some of the positive things that occurred during the budget. We met with the superintendent and we met with the treasurer. We got information that helped us to persuade and talk to legislators. You may recall that the House budget was more favorable to the interest of Cincinnati Public Schools than the Senate version. And we were able to utilize the information which Treasurer Wagner provided us, as well as information that Superintendent provided us, to have a coherent message to the legislators. And that message was the potential damage that the Senate's version of the budget would have on the work that CPS is doing, and the reason why this additional funding was utilized. We conducted meetings in Columbus with the superintendent, utilizing the data from the treasurer about why this was so important and the financial impact. George, Mr. Glover and I made numerous telephone calls to legislators during that time period, and we were very strategic about the people that we spoke with and got our message into caucus and also during conference committee, and that proved to be a favorable result for CPS. $12, $13 million to the good, somewhere in that neighborhood. And so that strategy, along with the superintendent playing a lead in reaching out to legislators, I think is something that we can replicate. And we're going to, in the fall, have a meeting with our local delegation and the superintendent and members of this board as you all see fit. Mr. Glover has some information that he would like to share in relationship to the report.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon. My comments are really more professional, personal observations in the process we went through during the most recently enacted House Bill 33 budget process. For those of us who have engaged in this process for many years, both myself, Eric, as a member of the state legislature, and myself as a professional advocate who has represented many different organizations, both education-related, not-for-profit, and for-profit, I can tell you that what we went through in the month of June and May was one of the most positive and rewarding experiences I see from a professional basis. And by that I mean it was good to see how CPS, as Eric has already noted, was able to coalesce in a coherent message and work together on behalf of a set of objectives with our state legislators. We're fortunate to have a number of good legislators connected to Hamilton County who represent and care about CPS, both on the Senate and the House side, both Democrat and Republican. We were able to engage those, and as Eric said, communicate with them effectively, both personally through meetings in Columbus, one-on-one meetings, as well as effective communications. We have position papers that were developed that were well received. We were able to respond quickly and also utilize the entire CPS team, including many of you here on the board who support our efforts. It was a very successful effort and one that can be and should be replicated in the future. On that point, we will continue to monitor closely those key bills that impact the operations of CPS. And there are many that will continue to be observed by and impacted by the state legislature going to next year. But we have set a groundwork here. We have set a framework here I think we will continue to work on in a very positive way that will be beneficial to CPS. As Eric noted, we hope to replicate an event that we've had in the past before. We're not quite sure about all the details yet. It could be in Columbus, it could be down here, where we personally invite members of the CPS to meet with us, not just us as a team, but us as a board, and really hear about what we have to say about CPS. We have positive momentum now. We developed and worked on that in a very beneficial way. Let's continue down that path. Let's utilize the positive momentum we developed, continue to use that on behalf of CPS, both in 2023 and 2024. Those are my observations, my comments. If there are any questions I can refer to, try to respond, I'll be more than glad to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you, Eric, for all of your work and for the update. Do board members have questions or comments for our lobbying team? Mrs. Weinberg.
Yes, I do have a couple of questions. I actually read through the documents. And my first question would be in regards to House Bill 38. I know with the school mental health days, I just was curious, how do you all see this going? I know it's in the first hearing. Just was kind of curious on that. And then I have 3 additional questions as well.
Okay, thank you through the chair to board member Weinberg. House Bill 38 deals with school mental health, and it permits 3 mental health days away from school each year for students. It's a bipartisan bill sponsored by a Democrat and a Republican, Jessica Miranda, who you may know is a local representative. So it hasn't had a hearing since April. It's definitely going to get, I think, a second hearing, but I don't know whether it will, whether it has legs or whether it has any momentum in terms of passage. They will be back next week. Oh, right. Okay, so George corrected me. The House will be in session 4 times this fall, and I know that the Senate is going to meet next week for just 1 day. So that kind of gives you an idea.
Yes, thank you. And then in terms of for the House Bill 103, it says it's in its 5th hearing. How many hearings can it go up to be, possibly?
Infinite.
Okay.
Through the chair, Ms. Weinberg, infinite.
Okay. So I was looking at that as, that might be in the last stages. It might, something could possibly happen with that. Okay. And then my other question is I saw that there was an update from Governor DeWine regarding the school buses and trying to make those safer. Wasn't quite sure if there was an update from him regarding when you had this report.
Through the chair, board member Weinberg, that is the most recent information. That is as of Friday, which is the last time that they made an announcement. I'm sorry, Having problems with the microphone. But that's the most current information about school buses. Yep.
Okay, thanks so much.
I do have one public policy issue that has been brought to my attention by an individual in Columbus who represents a coalition of organizations and groups who oppose the legalization of marijuana, which I think most of you know will be on the ballot, statewide ballot this fall. They've reached out to me and said, would CPS be interested in becoming involved in part of that coalition to oppose this ballot issue? If you're interested, I can gather more information, but I did want to relate to you that one communication I recently had.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Weinberg. Thank you, George and Eric. Other board members, Ms. Jones.
Yes, thank you. I'm just curious on House Bill 12, the reform of ODE. Do you have any sense of what, I know it's in the fifth hearing and who knows when it'll be complete, but do you have any idea, any thoughts on what that looks like structurally and functionally?
Want to go there? Okay, so through the chair, Board Member Jones, I'm having a day, right? Part of those reforms, General Counsel Hoying provided a letter to the state about those changes, and we went through them. Some of them were included in the budget bill, and I know that that's policy, and typically policy is not included in a budget, but some of those changes were incorporated in the most recent budget. I can get you what specifically was incorporated in the budget on HB 12 if you would like. I can follow up with the specifics.
Thank you. I think it would be helpful just to be updated on what changes are being proposed and where things stand. That would be great. Yes.
Thank you, Vice President Jones. Other board members with comments or questions? Dr. Moffitt.
So thank you for the report. This is so interesting and it's definitely informative. I have a question about House Bill 71 with regard to the workforce program. I know that there's some reorganization under the House Bill 12 for the Department of Department of Education and Workforce. How does that bill impact, if at all, CPS with regard to, it says Community Connectors Workforce Program?
Okay, to the chair, Board Member Moffitt, I'm not 100% sure I understand your question.
What is it about?
So this bill was voted out of the House and is now in the Senate. It hasn't been scheduled for a hearing yet in the Senate. So I'm not sure.
So I'm just wondering, what is that about? The Community Connectors Workforce Program, to make it appropriate. Like, what is that? What is that about? 71.
Okay, give me 1 second and I'll give you an answer.
Okay.
Eric, please take your time. If there are other questions from Dr. Moffitt or others while we're waiting, I'd be happy to get anybody else in. I'll take your time. Mr. Moreski, I'll go last.
I appreciate the update, Mr. Kearney and Mr. Glover. Thank you so much. It's very comprehensive. I was not as thrilled with the state budget due to my work with nonprofits in my day job. Our state is very unkind to children's services. In fact, we rank last. If we doubled our investment, we'd be last. I appreciate the work you've done on our behalf, and I certainly appreciate the superintendent being as active and the treasurer being as active. And so that's like the good news. Just to echo Mr. Glover, I think that's the good news in all of this, that it feels like we're kind of firing on more cylinders, at least, than we have. And like, this is new, at least for my eye, and it's great. I know other people have seen it, so I'm glad that y'all are here tonight too. And since it came up, and you know I want to speak my mind, I'll just throw out my 2 cents about the coalition opposing the legalization of marijuana, being that the roots of marijuana prohibition are deep in racism and keep many of our parents away from our kids. I would be adamantly opposed to this body joining any effort to oppose that.
Thank you, Mr. Moreski. While we're looking on the other question, I'll just raise one issue that we can come to at some point before we lose George and Eric. But, you know, a number of districts across Ohio have struggled with a transportation rule over the last couple of years. And I think there have been, for some procedural reasons, some short-term wins for districts on the transportation fine issue. But as I understand it, due to some more recent legislation and not administrative rulemaking, the strategy that districts have used in the past has a shelf life and a short shelf life. And I think some of the financial risk that we face is likely to continue and perhaps get worse, given that requirement is now a function of state law as opposed to administrative rulemaking. This might be an area where districts across Ohio would be looking for some help to advocate at the state level for a different kind of legislation. And I'm curious, before we lose you this afternoon, could you speak at all to the issues related to those transportation rules where you would or would not see an opportunity for some proactive advocacy for our legislative context, and any advice you might have for us? And if the superintendent has a different, or my colleagues have a different way of framing that question, please let me know. But I think this has been and will continue to be a real issue for us, and we could use the help.
I think to add to that, George, is right now, to our president's point, we're dealing with administrative guidelines or rules, and now it's become law. And so as of October 1st, what we've been able to do, or what districts have done collectively to try to get some relief because of the challenge that it will cause to them, come October 1st, we won't have that opportunity. And it's very likely, with the challenges of transportation across the country, that even in the best scenario, that there would be a possible fine. So I think that that's what we were looking to get some additional information on, right? Yes.
With that information, I think this might be another good opportunity for us to replicate or duplicate our efforts we made in May and June to really kind of narrow down what the specific issue is, what the financial impact is to CPS, and begin to have those quick conversations with members of our state legislature who can be impactful in this area. I would also encourage us, as we have done in the past, in the last operating budget, to perhaps make contact with other statewide organizations that might have similar problems, and maybe work with them to develop a more broader coalition at the statewide level. That is, I'm assuming that this same issue described in transportation will impact other large urban school districts as well. If that's a true or valid assumption, then perhaps we should reach out and broaden our coalition in Columbus, as well as continue to work hard with our local delegation in Hamilton County.
And I thank you for that, George. And I certainly defer, I think, to the superintendent and to you all as to what is the strategy and how to do that. I simply wanted to flag, just from my perspective, that this feels like one of the more important areas where we could leverage help in the coming year, and certainly would invite any disagreement or agreement from any colleagues on this topic. Ms. Bolden?
Really swore off talking about transportation, but I will back you up. Last week, I swore I went to church and everything about it. But that's a good church, good old Presbyterian church. What can I say? So one of the issues, of course, is the unevenness, the unfairness, the inequity, if you will, of us having to offer the services. But of course, that's where it is regarding non-CPS students, because they're all our kids. But I don't know, and maybe the superintendent treasurer can help me out with this, but some districts receive certainly more transportation kinds of dollars than we do, largely because they purchase fleets or buses, or there's monies there that, if you have been pretty reasonable throughout almost the last generation, outsourcing the function until we've, the recent crises that we've gone through. It seems as though schools that have been outsourcing or districts that have been outsourcing get fewer dollars. I don't know, that's just my impression, and maybe the superintendent and the treasurer could help me out with finding ways, if we could get more dollars for transportation, it would be helpful.
The monies that you're referring to is monies to help replace buses. We don't have that need, so we don't get that money. We don't have our own buses. But over the years, they've reduced the percent of reimbursement in the funding formula. So if we can lobby to increase that, that was at 50% or less. I have to look it up. I don't remember the exact,
Sure.
but
We can certainly make that a priority issue if that's the consensus of the board and CPS. The other dynamic that comes up occasionally in discussions with our legislators, and not very often, is the ongoing of the current status of relationship with CPS and Metro. So that's something that might be worth some conversation as well, going forward as well.
Ms. Bolton, did that give you a chance to share what you wanted to share?
Yeah, that's my point, and I think the treasurer backed it up on that we could receive more transportation dollars and are kind of cut out because we have been doing it this way for a while. But you're right, I think the Metro piece is a piece for all of us to consider, because since the ending of the extra routes, which we understand is not in the business plan for Metro or SORTA, our attendance rate at our high schools has declined significantly. And now part of that's COVID and all this other stuff that's been going on. And I'm sure we're building back up, which is great. But again, more of a shared responsibility. And indeed, out of Columbus came the ruling about our students that are 7th, 8th grade taking Metro, but private and chartered children not having, not being allowed, if you will, to use the Metro system. I think that's still in place. And that seemed to also be a discriminatory piece, depending upon how you look at it, from which side. So I think transportation, noting that we're, $50 million or something and making some success, and depending right now as we face fiscal year 24, I don't know, $19 million might be ESSER. That's part of that 50 million, and it won't be here next year. We are going to be in a financial crisis regarding transportation the coming fiscal year. So obviously it would be helpful to have that kind of, I don't know, some kind of interest from Columbus. So I appreciate Ben mentioning that.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton. I know, Dr. Moffitt, we had a question we were trying to get answered. Eric, thank you so much.
Okay, through the chair to Dr. Board Member Moffitt. So the way the legislation reads, the Department of Education will work through educational service centers who will hire directors. Those directors will be into schools, high schools, where they will provide opportunities for jobs and internships in the community. The directors are supposed to collaborate with Ohio Means Jobs. They will also determine with the district the number of students who can participate, and they will create an application process. They are supposed to report back, these program directors, to the Department of Education regarding the number of students participating, the number of students who are placed in jobs or internships through the program, the number of students who receive soft skills and professional skills training through the director, and they have allocated $8 million from lottery profits for the program. So again, that has not been passed, but that's the essence of the bill.
Vice President Craig.
So one of the things I did notice, and I again want to start by thanking you both for providing this report, but I did notice that there are a number of things also within there that mirror some of the same stuff we're seeing with the higher ed efforts from the state of putting in things that would require them to create policies to enact certain things. I looked specifically like House Bill, I think it's 214, that would, go towards those type of ideas of creating a policy on staff speech, or in a policy, I believe there's one that's also being discussed around a policy on religious accommodations and these type of things. And I worry a lot of times because some of these things are really are ways of causing us to take action by making us create a policy that derives our action, right? So as opposed to telling you you can't do something, we say you create a policy that mandates you do X, Y, and Z. And then it's in a way of saying, well, you can create your own policy, but the policy still doesn't mirror the expectations are. And I was just wondering if there's been any effort, or how do you see that effort going so far? I know at the higher ed level, there's been a lot of things passed that have pushed out to require higher education, like colleges and universities to create policies that in many cases are adverse to what their actual philosophy or mission or vision are. And so I worry similar things here.
Yeah, through the chair, board member Craig, I would just say that's the tension in the state of Ohio. And I would say that Florida is going through it and a bunch of other states are going through it. As a former elected official, we would never put onerous restrictions on or requirements on schools, right? You didn't think you were doing it, but when you hear from schools, right, they tell you they are onerous and there's not enough detail and it doesn't really match what the district is doing. So I think that's just the state of where things are from a larger picture. George, you may have different views than myself. Yeah, but you have the experience.
Eric is right. There are certain broad public policy issues that always seem to attract more attention than others. This is probably one of them. Just because it attracts a lot of attention doesn't mean there's necessarily going to be legislation enacted to address it, which could be good or bad, depending on what the circumstances are. What we can share with you is most of the meaningful legislation that impacts areas like what you're talking about will be probably introduced and considered and have hearings on during calendar year 2023 and up to probably the first 6 months of 2024. The balance of 2024, as you can imagine, will become election season. The legislators will go back home, and that's where they're going to spend their time and their priorities. So these issues that you might hear a lot, read a lot about, if they don't really reach an endpoint and have some final legislative solution by, I would say, late spring of next year, probably not much is going to happen unless something might pop up in that crazy season called the lame duck session after the general elections in November of 2024. That's a general rule. You have to stay tuned. We'll stay on top of it. I can tell you right now that things are probably going to be somewhat quiet in Columbus in the next several months because, again, the efforts will be more toward the November general elections to see what happens with some of these statewide ballot issues that have attracted so much attention. Finally, there is another major bill being considered right now. That is the biennium or biannual, every 2 years, state of Ohio capital budget. We've just finished the biannual state operating budget for 2 years. Then we'll go into that capital budget starting next year. And that has to be enacted by state law by the next fiscal year, that being June 30th of 2024. So that you will hear a lot about going forward in early 2024. So that's probably the best response we can give you at this point.
I appreciate that. And again, I think it's something for us as a district to pay attention to, but to your point, until it has moved with any traction through the legislature, it's not something for us to immediately worry about. But it comes to my mind because I think there are some actions that folks have taken over the years to respond to, in this case, higher ed, we've seen it, but specifically to respond to districts where they feel as though you've come afoul of what they would want the district to do. How do we make sure that we take some action towards you or towards a group of people?
Your point is well taken. I will tell you that I think the state legislature is probably taking a deep breath still from this last operating budget. I don't think there's going to be a lot of outbursts or activity in the near future just because they're still trying to digest, figure out what they passed by June 30th of this year, believe it or not. So there's going to be a lot of review and discussion and digression of that as well. So, again, just because you hear a lot of it in the public limelight doesn't necessarily mean it's going to end up result in final legislation, which could be good or bad.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, colleagues. Any last comments or questions for our lobbying team? Hearing none, we'll say thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you next time. And we're going to move to our next agenda item, which is on iReady, MyPath Pilot School Review.
Thank you, President Lindy. So this is, a part of this came up during our conversation last week as we were discussing goals and guardrails. And we thought that it would really be good to share it with the team, to share it in terms of how we're looking at not only what we're doing with assessments, but also how we're thinking about progress for students and how they're moving forward using some of the tools that we have. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is an introduction to this. During last school year, elementary schools were given the opportunity to pilot the iReady assessment. It actually started with the assessment pilot. So in transitioning into the district, the initial thought was there were some schools that would still be using MAP, but iReady had a very robust assessment system that went along with it. And so initially they were using the assessments. In transitioning in May, recognizing that we were using iReady for assessments, we then gave schools the opportunity to use the MyPath personalized instruction feature that goes along with iReady, as well as the teacher toolbox. And this was for reading in grades K through 6. So it was an amazing resource for schools. Of the 47 buildings with grades K through 6, 29 of them opted into the iReady reading pilot, and the remaining 18 schools continued to use MAP as their growth assessments and did not have access to the resources that went along with iReady, which again include the MyPath personalized instruction as well as the teacher toolbox. So the study analyzes the effect of using the MyPath personalized instruction tool with fidelity and improvement in state performance as measured by the Ohio State Language Arts Test. And fidelity we'll see on the next slide, just so that we'll understand how fidelity is being defined. Fidelity is being defined as the company defines it, 30 minutes of activity, at least 30 minutes each week with 70% accuracy. So essentially students they do the initial assessment on iReady. It's diagnostic. So from their diagnosis, they then receive a prescription. And when they then begin to use iReady on a consistent basis, they're doing that specific to their individual needs. So it caters to the needs of the student. During the assessment windows, it is then on grade level in terms of what that assessment would be, but their work that they're doing takes them through what they need in terms of the resources that would be available to them. So students in grades 3 through 6 were included in the fall projection to state testing comparison only if they tested in both terms, because as we know, we cannot get growth unless students test both times. And then students in grades 4 through 6 were included in the Ohio State 22 test to the Ohio State 23 test comparison if they tested both times as well. Students who were enrolled in a school that used MAP growth assessments were used as the control group because that was the consistent resource that they were using. And students who were enrolled in iReady pilot schools were considered as a part of the test group. For students enrolled in an iReady pilot school, their use of the MyPath personalized instruction tool was analyzed, and that's where it looks specifically at 30 minutes for the week, at 70% accuracy on the lessons passed. And there were 3 months that we did not collect the data because the months were disrupted. So August, December, and May. So this is just for a 7-month snapshot window of time. So there were some limitations in thinking about this methodology. There always is when we're thinking about data. It's important to remember that advanced is the highest level that a student can master. So if a student scored advanced, that would be a level 5 in 2022, or was projected to score advanced for the fall benchmark, there would not have been an opportunity of an indicator for improved, because that's considered the highest level. Likewise, because limited, the lowest performance band has a really wide score range. And so students may have made really good improvements within the time that they were using the resource, but they may not have gone to the next level. And for the purposes of sharing the data, this is actually students that went up a level as they were doing the assessment. So that doesn't capture the improvement within the group for many of the students. Overall results. Our fall projection to actual OST performance, and this was for grades 3 through 6. So if we will notice across the top, we have our months, and that's months of fidelity, starting with 0 months to 7 months. And then across the bottom, we have our MAP students because that was our control group. And if we'll notice, as we're looking at the performance of our 3rd through 6th grade students, and again, this was where they were projected from for their actual performance, where they were projected at the beginning of the year for the fall to where they actually performed at the end of the year on the assessment. And so we noticed that as we look across at each of the areas, if the students were using the resource with fidelity, at least 30 minutes a week, with 70% accuracy on the lessons that were completed, then we saw a greater increase. So as we look across, starting with 1 month, we saw some that didn't use it at all, and they still had some improvement, and we would expect that if students are working at what they're doing in classes. But as we are looking through each of the months, if we look down at month 7, for students that use the resource for 7 months, 30 with at least 30 minutes, or our definition of fidelity, those students, 50% of them improved in their actual achievement level. Overall, at about the 3-month period, we see where there was an increase over the test group, which was the MAP data that we were referring to. So that's just for the first group in terms of thinking about in the fall, when you take your baseline assessment, your beginning of the year assessment, that projection stated this is where you should perform at the end of the school year. Then throughout the year, you receive this intervention. And at the end of the year, this is where you actually test it. So this is based on our test data from May. So this is current test data, not test data from last year. So this is current. Next slide. Likewise, this is actually looking at students where they were last school year, so the previous school year. So this would have been the FY 2022 data. So May 2022 as compared to May 2023. And in noticing here, we see that there's still improvement if students were using the resource, but not at the same level in terms of thinking about their overall level of proficiency where they were the year before. So that was one level. So for example, if a student was at a level 2 in FY 22, which would have been last school year, now a school year removed, FY 22, then in FY 23, this is how they performed on the assessment. So what that says to us is, as we're thinking about where students are, the best indicator to look at is where they start at the beginning of the school year. And then from there, working with them in terms of the overall resource so that the students are not only getting that tier 1 support that they need in classrooms, direct instruction with teachers, but they also have this technology base that they have full access to all the time that also gives them an additional opportunity. The analysis says just that students scored higher on the Ohio State test. This is just for English because we only looked at reading. Then they were predicted in the fall on the benchmark. And students who used the MyPath personalized instruction for as few as 3 months with fidelity had higher percentage rates than those that were using the MAP assessment tool for that particular area. And there are a lot of different reasons. We began to talk about that a little bit last week. Both of these tools have a really close linking study in terms of how students are projected based on how they score on the assessments and how they ultimately score on the overall state assessment. The difference is the personalized instruction and the teacher support tools that go with one of the resources versus the other. And the same for the OST performance to OS 22 to 23. Students use the MyPath personalized instruction with fidelity for 3 months or more, had more students improve their score than those that did not. So the 6-month group was a little lower than the control group for percentages of students who improved their performance. So we really have to do a deeper study around those schools, what schools they were in, what the grade levels were, what were the practices that were done in that space, because that was the one area that appeared to be the anomaly. So that gives us an opportunity to do some additional research around. And our conclusions, as I shared, the methodology in terms of how we're looking at the information is it gives us one more data point that says that the resource that we're using in terms of assessment, in terms of support curriculum, as we're using the resource with the students are seeing the benefit of doing that. And we're able to close some of those gaps by doing that as well. So just a couple of different views for data, and I did share this with you already, but there were some things that we also called out, and I know that Board Member Bolton has asked a few different times about school type. So in this particular Excel, you have the schools that are broken down by the school, but there's also actually a column that breaks it down by school type as well. And that way we're also able to look at whether we're seeing something unique in the data by looking at the schools different ways. Our target population is, of course, not all of our schools because we didn't have all of the schools that participated, but it's enough to give some generalities around that. And on this particular one, this compares the top 10 schools in each category are highlighted in green. So that's what's in the far right-hand corner. And the bottom 10 schools in each of the categories is highlighted in yellow. And that's just to give us an opportunity to look at a little more deeply that data, what that data is saying to us, and what we're seeing around the average number of months for fidelity. And so we definitely see how this impacts what's happening in the classroom. Right now, beginning of the year, testing has already started. We're actually seeing that schools are, they're testing more in larger groups so that they can get the data back sooner, so they can start the intervention sooner. And so that's really important. That's really where we want schools to be. Next slide. A few different areas for us to continue to look at as we think about fidelity versus improvement by the pilot schools. Schools with higher average MyPath usage tend to have higher rates of improvement, and schools with lower average MyPath usage tend to have lower rates of improvement, but there were some anomalies. And so in thinking about those anomalies, there's also a place to do some additional studies. So the outliers were Evanston and Rockdale are in the top 10% of improvement by both improvement metrics, but are in the bottom 10% for the MyPath usage. So they still had improvement. They were in the top 10% for the improvement, but they happen not to use MyPath as much. So that means that we need to do a little deeper study there to see what else did they do that was not MyPath, but that gave them positive results. AMI and Westwood are both in the top 10 for one of the metrics of improvement and in the bottom 10 for MyPath usage. So for us, again, it's looking at what were those interventions. And the other thing I think that I would have to add in looking at the data, if they're able to do those things already without using the additional resource, then using the resource, you would even see a greater improvement from the students based on the data that we have. By contrast, Ethel Taylor is one of our schools that is in the bottom 10 for both improvement metrics, but had a really, really high level of MyPath usage. And so that again would say we want to go in, do some study around tier 1 instruction, because again, the resource is not designed to replace instruction. It's designed to support and help augment what students are already getting in their classes. If you'll click the link, Rob. So this is actually the link to the table that was in the earlier slide. Oh, I need to give you access. Okay, I'll give you access. This is the link to the table that was in the earlier slide. And what it allows you to do is to manipulate the slide itself. Okay, it'll likely come to me in a second, and then I'll give you access so that you can open it up, because you did it already? Okay, great. So thank you. So when we look here, if we will, Rob, if you will, just select on school type K through 6 in column C. Should be a little drop right there, yeah. It's view only. Okay. Here we are. So what we find is when we select the K6 column, and there are different ways to look at it, but in selecting the K6 column, we notice that we have, it's about a third, a third, and a third. A third that were in the green, a third that were in the yellow, and a third that didn't have, that were in the middle, where they didn't have, there wasn't an identified difference one way or the other in terms of the percentage of improvement for where they were in the fall to where they were in the spring. And then when we look at this same information, if you're sort on column I and just sort least to greatest, greatest to least in column I, Z to A. When we see this, we see a greater percentage, about the same percentage in the green area. So that means that they were in the top 10% for the growth, as about the same percentage in the bottom area as well. So we'll begin to, as we're beginning to share data, we'll begin to share it more this way so that we can begin to go in and disaggregate, really looking at the differences in the school types. If we pull just on K8, and we know we have 2-8, we have 3-8, we have 3-12. There are a lot of different options for us to look at in terms of what it looks like. So for our 3K8 buildings, we see that there was improvement for 2 of the schools. There was improvement in the benchmark to the spring, as well as the year before to the current year. And then one of the schools was in the lower percentage, the lowest 10% in terms of the type of growth that they had. So, but even within those schools, we're also seeing that the fidelity months right around the 2 months, even though 3 months was the most, they gave the most growth, 2 months with these schools, you also saw an increase in terms of fidelity, at least from benchmark to the end of the year. So just wanted to share this information to start with, because this is a really good starting place for us as we begin to really dig in a bit more to how we're looking at our data and how we're using it to impact what's happening in the classroom. I'll stop here in case there are questions.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Wright. Do we have questions or comments from board members? Sounds like there are not many. Are there any? Okay, I will ask just 2 very short things, and then we can keep moving. Superintendent, I think this certainly seems incredibly rigorous and important and different, I think, from past presentations on data that I can remember. And it certainly seems to me very powerful. Are there any members of your team who worked on this that we could thank?
Absolutely. So this actually, so the team that works on all of the information that we do around data is our IT and assessment team. So that's led by Jeremy Gollahue. The person that does most of the reporting kind of information where we sit down and go through the analysis together is Amanda Vargo. Kathleen Spellman is in there as well, but usually it starts with that group and then it branches out from there to do the additional questions, any updates that we might need. They have worked with me enough at this point to kind of anticipate some of the questions that I'm going to answer. So the goal each time is to have the data already ready so that when those questions come up, they're already there in the data.
Well then, to Jeremy, to Amanda, and to Kathleen, thank you for all of your hard work on this front. And then my last question, we do not need to spend a long time on it, but it strikes me that some of this could be publishable. I mean, is there ever thought or talk about trying to get some of the, I mean, looking at where the biggest impacts comes from certain kinds of interventions, that would be interesting, I think, to the field. Is that something that you all think about at all?
I think so. I don't know that with this particular data set, we've thought about that to start with. We are having additional conversations around all of the data, especially after all data is released, so that we can really go in deeply and look at each of the core areas, looking specifically at the students and the students' performance. But I do think it's very telling for the field because this was data that was done in-house. This was not done by, an outside party. And it's very specific to the data that we have for our students. And so already it started to impact what's happening for us in the field because it's a direct correlation to what schools see in what we share with them that we would expect to see if you do X. And so when you think about the research base behind the product that we're using, the research base was really strong in terms of, again, diagnosing and also giving prescriptive information so that you're able to really get to the core of the challenges. And we have the same kind of information for math, but there is not a control group because at this point, everyone K6, K5 is doing the same assessment with iReady.
Thank you. Any other last call for board member questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, Vice President Craig.
So, and I did notice, and it's one thing that maybe, I don't know if you guys are thinking about it or if you're already starting to think of strategies around it, but there's a substantial drop off in the number of folks who made it to that 4th month of fidelity.
We can go back to that slide for me.
Whether it's 3.6 or 4.6. Yeah.
Probably the first chart that we have. Let's just keep going up for me. Right there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so, you know, we have 609 that were tested, but then we drop down to 387, which is a substantial decrease. And so I just didn't know if there's any strategies around how do we build upon that going forward so we have a more sustainable number of folks who have done more than just the 3 months.
I think the first is sharing the information because, you know, as we talk about schools receive usage reports weekly. They have access to them because there is a full dashboard that they have complete access to. So they can tell their usage at their buildings, but we share that information with them because it's important for not only for them to see what's happening in their building, but how they are connected to other schools that are like schools and how they're connected to other schools that may be in their cohort, so forth and so on. So I think the first is to use this data. Our data belongs to us, and this is what we saw as a snapshot from our schools. And this paints a pretty substantial picture for the importance of doing that work. That's the first. I think the second is also the schools that had some of the best success with getting students to use the resource also made it competition for students. They made it exciting for students to participate in. Students were able to really chart their own growth and their own progress. And when you really start thinking about digging in deeply to student improvement, it starts with really students understanding their own data and being able to help monitor their data. So doing more around that. I think the third is making sure that we're engaging with parents and caregivers around the importance of our students actually doing this work. And so even, you know, and if they're doing it for homework or they have additional activity, that's a time when they could utilize this so that they're also helping to monitor that 30 minutes. But it's not just 30 minutes, it's 30 minutes at least a 70%, because that then avoids the point and click that we see sometimes when, you know, students are doing work. If you don't get to the point where there is a consistency, and it's not just 70 minutes, it's not just 70% the first time, it doesn't go up a level until it's 3 times. So 3 times consistently. So you've done the lessons, you've done the activities. Now, so you can show that you've mastered that, so to speak. Now it goes so that it gets a little more complicated for you each time, because the goal is to get you to your level and then beyond.
Thank you, Vice President Craig. If there are no other comments or questions on this presentation, we'll move to our third, which is the equity update.
Okay, so I am bringing this one back because the last time that we shared this, there were questions. And so I did want to make sure that we brought it back to take into consideration the feedback that you provided during the last time that we presented this, and the progress that we've made and the progress that we're looking to make in the short term, and how we're thinking about the next 3-year trajectory. So of course, you know the policies. We don't have to share the policies with you, but we are referencing policy 2255, equity and excellence in education, as well as policy 2256, our anti-racism policy. How is success measured? The success of the equity and anti-racism implementation is measured by progress towards our overall goals and guardrails. Success is also measured by advancing the expectations in the equity and anti-racism policies. So inherent in those policies, there was a lot of time, thought, and effort put into what the board wanted those policies to say, what the expectation was from the administration from those policies. Now we need to move forward to make sure that we're advancing those expectations based on the practice and the implementation that we're doing across the district. But we know that equity is a technical and adaptive challenge. Pursuing equity, including diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism requires recognizing both the adaptive and technical challenges. So as we think about technical challenges, the concept, situations where the problem and the solution are clearly evident and well defined. And then adaptive challenges are those where situations where the problem nor the solution are clearly evident or well defined. So often when we're thinking about our technical challenges, sometimes it's process changes that do not infringe on belief systems. People generally open to technical solutions and can easily identify them, so forth and so on. Our adaptive challenges are a bit different because sometimes in these areas, it requires changes in values and or beliefs. People may resist acknowledging adaptive changes. Solutions are needed in concert with those experiencing the adaptive challenge, so forth and so on as well. So as we go through the next steps for implementation, we do that in terms of thinking about how are we addressing the technical challenge and how are we addressing the adaptive challenge. Just gave some examples of technical challenges versus adaptive challenges. Adaptive challenges require change. It requires transformation. It's not just about implementation. And for those very reasons, those are more difficult because of the things that we just talked about a moment ago. So for example, technical examples, changing the doses of medication or changing a student's course schedule or adjusting school start times, amending the code of conduct, making sure that students have a device, or a computer device, or a device for computing. Those are technical examples, and those are things that we can update and give to every student by changing process. In terms of adaptive examples, changing lifestyle around nutrition or exercise, or changing beliefs about the importance of attendance, or modifying instruction as we think about the challenges that we had with COVID, or ensuring that there's equity in disciplinary decisions. That's not just a matter of changing a process. Often it starts with changing a mindset, changing a belief, and it also includes those that are on the receiving end of that so that the adaptive challenge can be actualized. So just our equity plan overview. So the way that we broke it out this time was to give the policy alignment for each of the areas and then to talk about the description of what we were doing in those areas. Talk about what we were doing in those areas so that we would be able to work through those. So the first is the plan takes a technical and adaptive approach as we are pursuing equity and anti-racism. Our technical components are discrete, bounded actions to take in the 23-24 school year and more tactical and process focused. So the first, our technical description, the first one is standardized disaggregated data analysis aligned to the goals and guardrails. And the policy alignment is both to policy 2255 and 2256. The second on the technical is to provide the data protocol and guidance to our LSDMCs in alignment with the goals and guardrails. And then our third action is to conduct a policy and process review for equity in the areas of school discipline. And in later years, we'll talk about enrollment, lotteries, grading practices, and those kinds of things. And 4 is to complete the Equity Index version 1.0. We know there's been a lot of work that's been done with that to start with, so we're really excited about making sure that we further that work. The 5th, create a community-centric equity roundtable. So we started the process in terms of doing that, but a place where we can also get additional feedback from the community around the area in the policy and the policy alignment that talks about overall engagement. And launch a web page on the CPS site that warehouses and makes transparent the equity and anti-racism work. So not only is this what we have in terms of policy, but this is what we're doing as a district to be responsive to the policy that the board has set before us. Then we move to the adaptive components, and we know the adaptive components, this is for this year, but we know that they, again, generally start with changing hearts and minds, and therefore it takes a little more time to make sure that we're at full implementation. The first is to elevate and align on DEI definitions and language use. And there are, you know, when we have discussions around DEI, around anti-racism, around equity, there are a lot of different definitions that are used. So for our district, what is the most important for us, and how are we going to move that forward in our work? Launch storytelling campaign highlighting lived experiences related to equity and anti-racism. And again, with the policy alignment, this is definitely to foster the universal values as expressed and adopted in the board resolution, and also to embrace the racial diversity within our district while actively eliminating practices that perpetuate racial disparities. The next is to support our LSDMC leaders in engaging their school community in discussing equity and anti-racism, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the upcoming slides. And to explore additional development and training options for the district as a whole. So what is the additional work that needs to happen in that space to make sure that we're actualizing each of the areas as a part of the policy and a part of the overall implementation plan. Next slide. Okay, so the first, we want to ensure that our data reviews and our board reports use this aggregated data to show equity, insights, and needs. So as we've spent quite a bit of time on discussing our goals, guardrails, and our interim goals, most of our goals have some level of expectation around looking at diversity and how students are performing when we think about diversity. And so this is important for us to make sure that we make that just a part of our regular work, so that we're able to talk through that and prepare for that as we begin to start monitoring our interim goals and guardrails. Analyze, monitor, and report data across equity groups. So that's race, gender, socioeconomic status, students with and without disabilities, possibly school type when relevant, and analyze for the root cause. Provide a data protocol and guidance to LSDMCs, and this is one that that we're really excited about, because there were a few of the LSDMCs that were really asking around this information. They knew that there was an equity policy. They knew that there had been work done on it, but they had not received resources that could really be helpful to them at their level in being able to do this work through the schools. So starting with supporting LSDMCs to ensure equitable outcomes in line with the goals and guardrails specific to their school sites. So starting in September, we've gotten some information that the report cards might be released earlier, so maybe September instead of October. But if supposing September is accurate, we start with the recommended data in terms of the cadence, and then October, help them look at their one plan review, which is connected to their overall school improvement. And then November, Action 5.1, the implementation update with the LSDMC chairs. And then December, the one plan review again, which is looking at disaggregated data. I think one of the most important parts about helping our LSDMCs work through the process is making sure that they have guiding questions to help them really analyze the data as they begin to also talk about next steps at their schools. So what are the areas that you celebrate? As you review the data, what do you notice? What do you wonder? What are the opportunities for improvement? And how can the LSDMC support the work in these areas? So just kind of starting at the very basic level of, this is the data, this is how we're talking about the data, these are some areas that we're looking at in the data, and then this is how you transfer that into what you're doing in your school building. And the same moving forward with thinking about the plan from January through May, continuing with the one plan review in February, looking at Action 1.2 from the implementation update, March Action 4.3, using all of that information to determine what else needs to be revisited in April. And then again, after the data is finished, begin to go back to the one plan review as well. So keeping those questions, those guiding questions at the forefront. So as we're thinking about the processes and looking to move forward so that we are moving forward the work across the board, we do want to analyze and audit our high profile areas that are sometimes prone to inequities, so that we're working through those processes and doing that in a group work format. The first, for this year's the code of conduct. We know we have a revised code, and for this year, our focus is really around restorative practices and making sure how that's becoming evident in our school buildings. But likewise, we also want to make sure, as we discussed in our last time together, that we're documenting discipline, that we're looking at what that is, so that as we're doing analysis based on what is actual, what is real, so that when we begin to see the kind of change we're looking for, we know that that is based on what we have in terms of baseline. And then we would like to have any proposed changes for the code of conduct to the board by May for the 24-25 code. The next area that we have thought about and working with others in terms of getting feedback and thinking about what was done in the other equity work was grading practices. And we know that grading practices is a big one. When you think across schools, across interactions, and what those policies and procedures are, we do have an aligned student progression plan now. So it's not really talking about how students move from grade to grade as much as it is how they are actually graded across the district and within their classes. And then with that focus for the 24-25 school year, with any recommendations to the board, hopefully by April for the 25-26 school year, April of 24. And then our enrollment and lotteries, 25-26 focus, and we know that that will be a huge one, a huge area to talk about and talk through, but want to make sure that we bring that so that we're able to talk through that so that we're really getting to the kind of alignment that we're talking about across the district. Complete the Equity Index version 1.0. The Equity Index is a tool used to demonstrate differences in need across schools. The index will guide resource allocations as we are proposing. The index will guide resource allocations to ensure those who need more get more, take into account student, school, and/or community factors, and be a key factor in decisions on how best to support schools. We are not anticipating that the index will impact base allocations of resources or negatively impact compliance, label individual students, or be the only factor taken into account on any given decision. Collaborative Equity Index development process, and we've begun this work. We've been talking about it for a period of time. There's been some entry work that's already been done on it, but now going into the deeper work around it. The work group composition is listed here for you. So it's a combination across the board of individuals that would be a part of the work group. And our timeline for kickoff is September, so that by November, we have at least our version 1.0 that we would like to be able to utilize to help impact how we're thinking about the 24-25 budget. And the last is to create a community-centric equity roundtable. We talked about this earlier. Some have given recommendations for individuals that came up at the last meeting that we were in, but in the process of having those identify across the board so that they can be a part of those initial roundtable conversations around equity. And then launching the equity webpage, creating transparency into the district's work. Things to include would be the annual equity and anti-racism plan, progress reports on implementation and impact, data and analytics, and any engagement opportunities for the community. Adaptive components of the plan as well. Level set and elevate the DEI definition. So what are our working definitions? Each month, explore a DEI term and definition, bringing clarity and alignment throughout the district. What does it mean to you? Where do you see this show up in the actions in the district? And what can we do to bring this idea to reality in more places for more people? And we have work, if you'll go back for me, the current working definitions were developed in 2015. And so it provides working definitions for diversity, equity, inclusion, and excellence in education. And so that would give us a place to continue to grow off of. Launching storytelling campaigns, highlighting the diversity within our district, explore how equity and inequity has impacted lived experiences, elevate local history in the context of which CPS pursues equity and anti-racism, highlight and celebrate what stakeholders are doing to promote equity and anti-racism, and celebrate local pioneers for equity and anti-racism. And so profiling the stories from those in the room, from those in the district, from those that have supported the district, so that it becomes just a part of the way that work is done and a part of the culture of the overall district. And support our LSDMCs in implementing anti-racism policy, providing chairs with training, guidance, and protocols to advance equity and anti-racism, so that there's opportunity for a structured sequence of learning, so that we're working through the work together and not in isolation. And currently, we are exploring grant funds to support this programming, and we'll offer additional direct staff-led programming as well, and looking at a variety of evidence-based programs that have worked in other places as they're also lifting this voice. Explore additional development opportunities within the district as well, and how are we looking at that structure and that learning also. And our speaker series, increasing access for personal and collective growth in DEI. So the speaker series would include quarterly symposiums highlighting local voices and contexts, open to all stakeholders with a range of DEI areas and topics. The plan continues to support the focus on the key equity areas: recruitment, strengthening pipelines for teachers and leaders of color, and curriculum, AP African American History course, and cultural integration into the curriculum. And that's where I'll stop, and I'll open up for questions at this time.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Wright, for the comprehensive update. Questions, comments, or reactions? Starting with Mr. Morosky.
Thank you, President Lindy, and thank you, Superintendent. This may be one of the best, if not my favorite presentation I've seen in 6 years for a whole host of reasons. Ever since I got here, I know when Ms. Bolton was here and the equity policy was passed, and Ms. Jones, that was a really historic move. And then in the past few years, the anti-racism policy, which was an interesting policy because there were some things in it that were a little more prescriptive than you may have actually seen in a typical policy, that we moved to an addendum, et cetera. But a lot of those things have not happened. And a lot of the promises of the equity policy, while progressive and has made our district more progressive, at least in my opinion, than most any other, still some of the concrete, like the technical stuff, certainly the adaptive has been lagging, in my opinion. The technical has happened to a point, but not like this. And what I like about the technical and the adaptive, which is way more difficult, you're correct, you don't need me to tell you that. The technical you can measure, but even the adaptive with some of the things that are up here is actually able to be measured. The second thing I wanted to say is, I think this was an interesting presentation to end with, because the one we began with a presentation, while this was never said explicitly, about a bunch of bills that are hostile toward our students, particularly our Black students and their families. You go through that list, and there are explicit bills on that list we were handed that would seek to prohibit a lot of what we just saw, particularly the curricular pieces. And I think it's important, if anyone's watching, if they're not, that's a shame, and hopefully the people are will tell their friends. I think it's important to note that we're doing this, and we're going to do this, regardless of what these people in Columbus who aren't taking this work seriously want to do, because this is serious, and our kids deserve the best from us. And then the last thing I would say, the only thing that was missing was anything about us. And when we talked in our meeting last week, we talked a lot about how we define the culture of the district. And just again, speaking for myself, defining culture is not passing policies and implementing new programs because of them, it is modeling it. And I've been very fortunate to be surrounded by a lot of people in my career who don't look like me, who have helped me try to be less of a stupid white guy. Because it's hard being raised in a country that tells you you're always right. People that look like you are always in charge. And it's hard to unlearn that in your 40s, even if you were raised by cool parents who weren't jerks. That's real, that's hard. And making decisions differently. And I think it would be nice if we, I don't know what it means, and maybe this is something for us to figure out, to model this behavior, all of us together, whether it's an implicit bias training, not an hour presentation. I don't know what this means, but I do think it's important that we model it and not just have these policies and then have a superintendent who has the courage and the know-how, et cetera, to implement change so that our students get what they deserve. So that's what I would end with, and that's a challenge, I think, to us. I don't know what it means, I don't. But I think we need to model it as a board, and I didn't see us up there, and I think we should be, but that's on us, not you, so thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morosky. Ms. Jones.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate where Member Morosky it kind of brought us on a historical perspective of this. I think where we are now, and I agree with everything he said, I think where we are now, I feel like oftentimes that I don't know how to say it. I'll just say that it feels like there's no movement. So this is, I think, a good way to sort of reset kind of where we were and historically how we come to this point. I really appreciate the slide number 4 that says equity is a technical and adaptive challenge. That's a very, very powerful kind of concept. And I think because most people think that they practice equity, that everything is good, and right. I'm good, I don't need this, you know, that kind of thing. And the technical challenges are always the ones that people accept. What people have trouble accepting, including us, are the adaptive changes. What does that mean for oneself and our behavior and our thinking and how we approach things? And it does require some digging deep into, you know, how we approach our everyday scenarios. So I do agree. This is a lot of information to absorb, but I really do feel like that number 4 speaks to where I am in terms of my thinking about this whole approach. This is, you know, technical is good, adaptive is good, but trying to make sure that everybody gets all of this and measuring the success for it, I think is where the challenge is. But thank you, anyway.
Thank you, Vice President Jones. Other comments from board members or questions? Dr. Moffitt.
So I'll share. I think this is great. This is definitely a step in the right direction from where we were. It has more concrete measurement and actually some action items to advance us to where we need to go, at least moving on the plan. I, as a DEI practitioner, I am really into and want to just make a suggestion that we include other areas for diversity in that. The letter from the LSDMCs talked about having training, not just the normal trainings, but I think the letter from April talked about like even implicit bias training and things like that. I would love to see in the plan where the LSDMCs are included along with the teaching staff, along with some of our other staff on professional development regarding equity, because I think that that's more holistic and they've asked for that. They've actually asked for movement in how do they deal with some really tough issues that they're having to deal with in trying to align with and fit within the policies on anti-racism and equity. With regard to the diversity, I would love to hear some trainings for students and staff on disability equity. What are we doing there? Our vendor selections, because it's not just about race. We stay there. We stay on the things that we can kind of concretely touch, but learning styles. And then the discipline data, I know because I'm involved with the NAACP, that's been a request for where we are now for years. And so to even though one of the slides was talking forward thinking about we're going to do this in the future, but I think to even have a baseline of this is what we see now, like a needs assessment. This is where we are, good, bad, or indifferent. This is where we are specifically around discipline. It's been a request. And I personally think, I know it's not where we want to be, but it is a starting point. And there is such power in acknowledging where we are, even though it is not the best, it is where we are. And then talk about bringing others towards where we want to go. So a needs assessment. And then one thing that I actually worked with a couple of schools on that I was suggesting years ago was a culture audit. The schools want culture audits. They know that their culture is a certain way, or they know that they have things that they need to work on. So I just would love to see where the schools are involved, either through the LSDMCs or through the PTOs. They're involved in establishing where they are in relation to the goals and guardrails, in relation to the strategic plan, because I think that there may be some, I don't want to say disconnect, but just to make sure and ensure that there is connectivity between what the schools are seeing in their site with regard to culture, with regard to diversity, in all of the areas of diversity, and where we want to go with respect to our goals and guardrails. I think it's a great plan, and I think it definitely has some tangible things that the community can buy into. I just would implore that we be honest and transparent with where we are, because that's what we've been asking for before I got on this board. That actually hasn't happened. It's been kind of fluff. And so when we talk about technical challenges and adaptive changes, I like that. But we need to also acknowledge to the community with regard to those areas of diversity, and there are many beyond race, but where we are with that. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moffitt. Any other last comments or questions? Vice President Craig.
I'll make two quick ones. First, and I wanted to just, again, thank you all for putting this together, but I want to highlight one of the things that I think is really important with doing this is that it's a challenge that I guess I keep saying over and over again, because Garrett Bolton on the Budget and Finance reminds everybody that I've been saying it for a long time, but the reality is that we do have a budget crisis next year, and that part of what we committed ourselves to doing as a board is both identifying where our priorities are, but also identifying where there are challenges that we need to set resources towards. And I think that's one of those things you have to do in an equity framework, because it's really easy to say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to make this school better. It's really hard to say to someone else, you're not going to get X, Y, and Z anymore. And that's a challenge that we're going to have to think about, and we're going to have to review. And so I think it's important to do this in that framework of recognizing programming needs, recognizing curriculum specific needs that are there. The second thought that I had, and I think it's worthwhile to kind of, for us as a board, to also be thinking about as we go into our next year's phase of these things, is that there are some challenges that will take a long time to get to. And I know Board Member Jones talked about it, sometimes it feels like things weren't moving, right? And some of that is both our district's culture, but some of that is our city's culture and the challenges that we will face as we improve. And I think that opens up opportunities, though, for us to have partnerships with folks who have seen us not move, who may now see us moving, right? Like a lot of the folks that I have heard from, and a lot of folks I think the board members have heard from, the challenge is always that when you went to work with CPS, it's just going to take forever to get it done. And you felt like it wasn't going to be, whether it was getting through the red tape, whether it was getting something done, the approval, the results, all these different things. And I think this is part of that world also, is how do I benefit those folks who I really wanted to make a difference for in a way that will also give opportunities for others. And so I think this is a great opportunity for us to think about that in that equity lens as well. Is while some things may take a long time to get done, some things can be done to speed up that process. And so to Board Member Morosky's point, passing the policy wasn't the stopping point, it was the starting point. Now let's progress it further.
Thank you, Vice President Craig. Other last comments before we move on? Ms. Bolton.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the report too. And I think I'm happier with this than I was before. And I'm not surprised at all. I know we're all deeply committed to doing this, right? And again, to Carolyn's point, I like that adaptive and what have you. It helps me understand. And I would say that the adaptive, as you say, takes time, but that other end needs to start to be a grocery list and a check mark list and a timeline for that list. Yeah. That this is going to happen on this day, this is going to happen on that month, because now that you framed it for us, and I appreciate it just intellectually, thank you. So we not only have the checklist that was in the policy, both the equity policy and the racism policy, which did provide a checklist and a path forward, anti-racism. The issue for us now is to actually do. And a couple things. Advisory groups, at least for the most part in suburban districts, advise the board. They don't necessarily advise the administration. So I think we need to kind of figure that out. Another point is on this equity thing, what was raised in finance a few months ago. And I think my colleagues will remember where we said, let's start, even on the financial piece, let's start thinking in terms of all the resources being able to be accountable at the school level. Because that's going to be the most difficult and the most controversial, perhaps, guideposts that we have, so that we have this aggregate piece of budget process, and we have this district-wide formula and what have you, which makes complete sense, except for equity, because it has nothing to do with equality. But if we are focusing on really having an understanding of what each school has, and I know I've heard the superintendent and the treasurer say, wouldn't it be great to have a list of every school we have and every service, every aspect of their programming, even when we're trying to assess the value of our community learning centers, or what do we get from our school-based health centers. I mean, I think something can be that rudimentary, and we can see. I'll close by two things. I think part of equity needs to be to redesign the school day, especially for our teenagers. I think there's equity in thinking about a new school day. The other thing is, this is interesting, this morning I had the privilege of teaching a class at Schroeder, largely due to the campaign. Nobody wanted any wisdom or anything from me. They were just interested in about how you run for office, which was great. I was happy to share. I'm not sure how I used to do that for 5 times or 6 times, and on 2 years, 7 times a day. So it was humbling, but they asked great questions. Besides, they want better food and what have you. But which is teenagers, I would expect that and hope for that. And I know Carolyn's pointed that out any number of times. But I had one young lady raise her hand, and I didn't see it at first, and then I saw it because I think some of her compatriots said, "Oh, she has a question." And she actually said this. I believe this is as good a quote to teach us all. She said, "Does CPS work to get so many poor students?" And I said, "You mean people that have economic struggles?" She said, "Yes." Y'all work to find everybody that has those struggles. That was bone chilling, tear making, whatever. She's so perceptive. She's surrounded in this wonderful, wonderful high school, and in her life or whatever, she senses that the people with whom she's dealing, all share these great challenges. And so I think there needs to be not only rethinking the school day as part of your thinking, if I can be so presumptuous, but also a tremendous effort toward thinking about that impact of economics on our kids, because it really has, I think, more impact maybe than we fully appreciate. They're confusing and making difficult their lives and their families' lives. So happy for the report. I want to study it more and think more about it. And I go teach a class.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton. I'm headed to Schroeder on Friday and look forward to finding your students. Thank you, Superintendent. As we near on 5:30, I promised I was not going to keep people over, so we won't. What I will do instead is just preview what we'll do instead at the meeting on Monday. which is, I don't think, we have a lot going on in the meeting on Monday. We have a budget to discuss and approve. We have bylaws to review and hopefully approve. We have a mission, vision, and forecast resolution to review. There's a lot that's on tap. I don't think we'll have time to do a full extended discussion on our priorities, but I think we got to start because I think there's a danger in executing too much without a clear set of priorities. So here's what I was going to do this afternoon, and we'll do this during the meeting on Monday. I just want to give everybody on the board a chance to share what they think our most important board priorities should be between now and the winter holiday. So think about that. This should be succinct, 30 seconds to a minute. And the goal for that time is just to get a list of what everybody says. And so everybody can hear each other share what they say. We'll then have to carve out some time the following week to deliberate on that. And then if we need to, do some voting. But as a first pass, come ready Monday to share in about a minute what you think our most important board work should be between now and the winter holiday. Any other items or business before we close our committee of the whole meeting? Having no other business before us, I declare our meeting adjourned. Have a good evening.